day everyone. So I will be reporting to you the cognitive metaphor theory, a theory proposed and introduced by Lakoff, Johnson, and Turner. So we will be acquainted with various types of metaphor theory, such as the cognitive metaphor theory, novel conceptual metaphor, which also has types such as can do with the orientational, the ontological. And we are also going to learn and understand the blending theory, which will be part, of course, of this report. Okay, so we have here a basic example of what a metaphor is. Okay, so we have "You ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time." Probably all of you know from which song was this taken. It was taken from a very popular song, "Hound Dog," "Nothing But a Hound Dog," by Elvis Presley. Okay, and we have here an idea of metaphor. So when we say metaphor, basically we are trying to state that one thing is actually the other thing. So in this case, in this very popular line, okay, of a song, we are trying to compare you to a hound dog, which is crying all the time. And then it equates those two things, not because they are actually the same, but for the sake of comparison and symbolism. Okay, so poetically calling things something else. So that is a metaphor. However, for the cognitive metaphor theory, it's one of the most influential aspects of cognitive stylistics that has been. And this proceeds on the basis that metaphor is not limited to literacy texts, but it is a pervasive phenomenon in all text types. Furthermore, it asserts that metaphor is that it is the practice of talking about one thing as if it were the other or another, on the grounds that there are some notional similarities between two entities. So going back to the example, what we are trying to compare here is the you, whoever is this, and then the hound dog. And then the idea why they are the same is that both are actually crying all the time. And then there are also other songs that are filled with metaphors, not just similes. So death's a debt that everybody owes. That is a famous line from Harrison. And using the terms of traditional rhetoric, death is the tenor of the metaphor. So when we say tenor, what is being discussed? And whereas the debt is the vehicle, the purport to definition. Clearly, the meaning that is being conveyed here is the death has some qualities we associate with debts. Perhaps in the sense of being unwished for, being something inescapable, or something to be feared. Probably other people would think that having debt is also looking forward to your own death. Okay. So as mute as monks, tidy as bachelors, they manicure their little plots of earth. So this is taken from Men and Allotments from Fanthorpe in 1978. There are what traditional rhetoric would refer to as the grounds for comparison. Leach describes metaphors as convert comparison, contrasting this with the overt comparison of simile, where the comparison between the two entities is made explicit, just like the examples above. So what are we trying to compare here? The monks, the bachelors, the manicures. Okay. So we have as mute as monks, tidy as bachelors, and manicure their little plots of earth. Okay. Alright. So however, traditional distinction between metaphor and simile is one that only exists in formal grammatical terms. Both figures of speech involve comparison of two separate entities. Fundamentally, they achieve their efforts by the same conceptual processes. The idea of metaphor and simile actually have the kind of the same concept in terms of understanding the process of comparing two things. However, when we are talking about simile, there is this clue or keyword which makes us understand, or which makes us think that that is really simile by just simply looking at it. So we have the words like or as. However, for the metaphor, these words are nowhere to be found. The pervasiveness of metaphor in all discourse type has been one of the major findings of cognitive metaphor theory. In addition, we have noted that cognitive theory makes the point that metaphor is not just a matter of language, but also a matter of thought. You really have to dig deeper, in order to understand the concept of how the metaphor is used linguistically. So we have here other examples such as, I feel as if I'm going nowhere, we'll get there and promise you we overcame a lot of hurdles to gain this degree. Cognitive theorists for them, all the sentences on the previous slides were different linguistic instantiations of the same underlying metaphor. Each sentence describes life as if it were a journey that we make. In cognitive metaphor theory, this underlying theory is called the conceptual metaphor. So we can find that these examples are found under conceptual metaphor theory. Conceptual metaphors are written in small capitals as in life is a journey. All conceptual metaphors consist of a target domain. So we have a target domain and a source domain. For the target domain, that is something that is being discussed, equivalent to the tenor on the preview slides that we had a while ago in traditional approaches, and a source domain. A source of the metaphor, similar to the vehicle. Okay, so life is a journey. We have here life, that is the target domain. What are we trying to compare to our source domain? So journey is the vehicle or our source domain. When we interpret conceptual metaphors, we map concepts from the source domain onto the target domain. So for example, when we use conceptual metaphor, life is a journey, we have mappings there, and one of the mappings that we make between the source domain and the target domain is to think that person living as a traveler. So all of us, I believe, have experienced this one way or the other. Living life as a traveler. So that's why if you're being asked to understand or how you see the term life as a journey, we can all relate to it. I mean, all of us have our own idea linked to it. So for instance, we might say, as I feel as if I'm going nowhere, or he's getting ahead of himself. Other examples of mappings are purposes or destinations. For example, you get there and promise. The difficulties or obstacles on the journey, she overcame a lot of hurdles to gain her degree. What should be apparent from the examples is that conceptual metaphors are cognitive structures that underpin our metaphorical use of language. Since cognitive metaphor theory makes clear the connection between language and thought, it has the capacity to be useful and analytical tool for cognitive stylisticians. So if you wish to make use of this as a subject for research, I believe this theory could be very helpful. Okay, so for example, applying cognitive metaphor theory can show up ideologies that underlie the surface from the text. So for example, in sentence number 8, Mr. Blair was attacked by the Liberal Democrats for hypocrisy. The notion of Mr. Blair being attacked is not meant to be interpreted literally. Instead, attacking is a conventional metaphorical way of describing the notion or action of criticizing someone. So you did not literally use the term, the term criticize. However, you made use of other terms or other metaphorical ways in order to criticize. Okay. And Commons leader Robin Cook has come under fire from John Prescott for attempting to use politicians' families to score political points. Leaping to Mr. Blair's defense, Mr. Prescott said he deplored members of the media or other politicians who brought family members into politics in this way. There is a similarity to examples number 8 and number 10 because they all share the same underlying conceptual metaphor. Argument is war. In this conceptual metaphor, concepts from the source domain of war are being mapped onto the target domain of argument. Being criticized is likened to being shot at And supporting someone's argument is likened to physically defending them, just like leaping to Mr. Blair's defense. When we talk about arguments and arguing, we use the same kind of language as when we talk about war and fighting. So somehow, if you are into an argument, it's like getting into a war. It's like fighting for your ideas, standing up against different opinions of other people. The conceptual metaphor argument is war is deeply entrenched in Western society, and the implications of using this metaphor are significant. So cognitive metaphor theorists have begun to see these patterns as evidence that, far from being inactive, these conventional metaphorical ways of talking about particular activities and practices suggest that we conventionally think about these things in particular ways. With regard to argument as war, it was explained that many of the things we do in arguing are partially structured by the concept of war. We can therefore begin to see how the way we use language reveals a lot about how we conceptualize the world around us. So language is also very tricky, and because it can help us build our own understanding of how the world works, even though that is actually different from how others would see it. So when we use the metaphor of war to refer to arguments, that we're really doing is showing how much we think about arguing as being war. Fairclough makes the same point when he claims that the militarization of discourse is also the militarization of thought and practice. Okay, so that was all for cognitive metaphor theory. Now let's go to novel conceptual metaphors. Okay, so novel conceptual metaphors are not restricted to literary language, and as with the examples of conventional metaphors that have been examined, using this theory or using this metaphor reveals something of the way in which the user conceptualizes the world. Okay, so we have here examples such as during the Cold War, he knew where he would be fighting the weather, the name of his enemy. He compared his job then to the second violin of the London Symphony Orchestra. You had a sheet of music with clear notation. Now, he said it's jazz, improvising. In the example, concepts are mapped from a novel source domain onto the target domain of war. The novel conceptual metaphor that underlies the linguistic metaphors that Burge uses is warfare is music. Modern warfare is described as the type of music, jazz, meaning perhaps that it is improvisational and that there are no hard and fast rules. Music is more commonly perceived as an art form and participation in music as a pleasure. Here, though the domain of music is being used to talk about war, and arguably the underlying conceptual metaphor gives warfare a frivolity and a license that it shouldn't have. Types of conceptual metaphor. Conduit metaphor. So the speaker puts ideas, so the ideas or the objects into words which are the containers, and sends the sending or the process of sending is a long conduit to a hearer who takes the idea or objects out of the word or containers. The conduit metaphor is thus an overarching metaphor for the following conceptual metaphors. So we have ideas and meanings or objects, linguistic expressions are containers, and communication is a process. It's how we send the idea to our hearer. So we have examples here. I'm finding it hard to put my ideas into words. You've given me an idea. What the teacher said carried a little meaning, and you need to get your ideas across if you are to succeed. Okay, another type of metaphor is orientational metaphor. Orientational metaphors are somewhat different in structural metaphors. Rather than structuring a concept in terms of another, we provide a concept with a spatial orientation. So the category of orientational metaphors begins to explain many otherwise odd expressions that we commonly use in language. Why, for example, do we talk about things in high spirits when we are happy, but feeling down when we are depressed, right? So it's language is very what's this, very helpful in understanding these. And why do we talk about climbing a career ladder or being at the bottom of the class? The answers to these questions can be found in the following conceptual metaphors. Happy is up, sad is down, conscious is up, unconscious is down, good is up, bad is down, health and wealth are up, sickness and death are down. More is up, less is down, high status is up, low status is down, the future is ahead, and the past is behind. The metaphors certainly help us to understand why we use those phrases, such as he's at the top of the profession. But we might as well ask why it is that such conceptual metaphor are engraved in our consciousness, right? So it's like it's been there the whole time. It's just waiting to be used in order to understand the interplay of words in a certain sentence. The answer to this seems to be that many of these orientational metaphors have their origins in a physical basis. For example, when we talk about waking up, right, we are up. And when we are falling asleep, we are down. Because humans sleep lying down and standing up when they are awake. Ontological metaphors. This type of metaphor is used for a variety of purposes, among which are quantifying, setting goals, and referring. So, for example, America has a lot of political capital invested in Iran. So we have a quantifier here, a lot of political capital, but we have just a lot of for quantifier. Dick Whittington went to London, so the setting goal. He went there to seek his fortune. And her fear of flying is a huge problem. What is that huge problem that we are trying to refer to? It's the fear of flying. So that is the idea of ontological metaphor. Seems this is actually, an easy way of understanding how metaphors are being used in a sentence. In each of the cases, the italicized part of the sentence is being treated metaphorically as a substance. A further ontological metaphor is the container metaphor. Noting that humans are territorial by nature, Lukoff and Johnson suggest that the notions of bounded objects in bounded physical spaces are prime candidates for metaphor. A boundary between one space and another may be denoted by what a person's visual field can encompass, leading to the conceptual metaphor, which we call visual fields are containers. Typical linguistic instantiations are as follow. The attacker was outside his victim's field of vision. So we have visual fields. We have on the first sentence, outside. The sailors had been out of sight of land for weeks. So another visual field, which is used as a container, is out of. And the hang glider hove into. So the outside, out of, and into are all visual fields. Many of the source domains in these metaphors derive from bodily experience. In this respect, we can make a connection between cognitive metaphor theory and the notion of image schemas. Namely, that image schemas often work as source domain and conceptual metaphors. So, for example, a container image schema is working at the source domain in example 16 and 18. Previous slides a while ago. However, although image schemas are important to conceptual metaphors, there appears to be one principle at work that restricts which image schemas can work as source domains for which target domains. Lukoff described this as the invariance principle. This hypothesizes that the mappings between domains of a conceptual metaphor preserve the schematic structure of the source domain in a way that is consistent with the structure of the target domain. To illustrate this, Lukoff and Turner used the example of the conceptual metaphor where death is a destroyer, realized in such linguistic instantiations as death cut him down, and in the classic image of the Grim Reaper. They argue that while death is a destroyer, it is commonly understood metaphor. A metaphor such as death as a musician would be less easily understood. That is because death is more of a destroyer than death being a musician. And that is a specific instantiation of a generic level metaphor. Events are actions. Well, event, death, the action, destroying. According to this invariance principle, the generic level schemas of the generic level metaphor must be preserved in the specific instantiations of the generic event. The schematic conception of death is that it brings about the sudden physical change in an entity. Hence, the schematic concept has to be preserved in the source domain of the metaphor. The action of destroying preserves the schematic concept of bringing about a sudden change. So destroyer is the more appropriate term to describe death, not musician. The action of playing music, however, does not bring about a sudden physical change, meaning that musician is a source domain seems inappropriate. Blending theory. The oft-quoted exemplar of basic problem with cognitive metaphor theory is the metaphor the surgeon is a butcher. Evans and Green note that this exchange is not easily explained by cognitive metaphor theory, since the fact that butchery is a highly skilled profession. Cognitive metaphor theory cannot explain where the negative assessment of the surgeon originates from. A potential answer to the conundrum lies in the blending theory, which was developed by Fauconnier and Turner. Okay, so this theory proposes a model for emergent meaning that is based on the idea that meaning is generated as a result of blending elements from various input spaces. Well, cognitive metaphor theory proposes the notion of mapping concepts. So the concept of mapping was or is very significant in cognitive metaphor theory from one domain of knowledge into another. But blending theory suggests that meaning construction is dependent, not necessarily on such pre-existing knowledge or the schema or the image or schematic image or the image of schema, but on temporary knowledge structures created during online processing. The mental spaces of Fauconnier. So an integration network is a model of how these temporary structures give rise to emergent meaning. So we have here an example of a conceptual integration network for surgeon as a butcher, which was based on the model proposed by Evans and Green. Okay, so we have here input space 1 and input space 2. So the concept of we have an agent, undergoer, sharp instrument, workspace, procedure. If you're going here to input space 1, we have the role of a surgeon, and then for input space 2, the role of a butcher. So who is undergoing the surgery? So the role, therefore, we have in input space 1 the patient, and for input space 2 the commodity or the animal. The sharp instrument that is being used by a surgeon is a scalpel, and for the sharp instrument used by a butcher is a cleaver. For the workspace and operating room, for probably a slaughterhouse or a battoir, and then the procedure, the goal is to actually heal someone, but the goal of a butcher in killing an animal, okay, in butchering an animal is to sever the flesh, okay, and for the means, surgery, the means is butchery, okay. So the identity of the surgeon, this is the identity of a butcher. In the diagram, there were two input spaces on which we can identify elements associated with surgeon and elements associated with the butcher. The unbroken lines between input spaces 1 and 2 represent mappings between these two domains. The two input spaces are inked by means of generic space in which we find higher order elements that are shared by the input spaces. The blended space includes some information from the two input spaces and some that is to be found in neither input space. In the case of the surgeon as a butcher, the blended space contains a concept of a surgeon and the butcher as being one and the same. The blended space also blends together the goal of healing with the means of butchery. Again, only in blended space can this be the case. These blends generate an emergent meaning of a surgeon attempting to heal a patient using the techniques of the butchery, a clearly an appropriate endeavor which leads to our conception of surgeon as incompetent. Another example for conceptual integration network for generic space, we have a story of Samarin, the Mohican, Matchstick, and the Jeepney. These are the prisoners in a Siberian labor camp in 1919. The Mohican has been protecting Samarin from the harshness of camp life and has been providing him with extra rations in order to build up his strength for the escape attempt that the Mohican has assured him they will make together. In this extract, Samarin is reporting a conversation he overheard between the Mohican, Matchstick, and the Gypsy. I heard raised voices in the other part of our barracks, the other authorities, Matchstick, and the Gypsy. Gypsy, who'd spread into the niche, left when Machine Gun was murdered. We're after something from the Mohican. Matchstick said, "You've got to share. It's too much for one." The Gypsy said, "It's the end. Finished. Time to do the town, brother. Just a little piece. A tiny little piece. I'll have the heart. Me. Raw heart. Still hot. That's what I like." And Mohican says, "You've got to share. Where are you going with him? Run in midwinter? You won't get 5 miles, you and your pig." And Mohican said, "I told you not to use the word in here. I'm going to have this one," says Matchstick. "I'll cut him like an artist, and then I'll kill him." "You'll not be an artist," says Mohican. "You haven't got the imagination." Listening by the stove, I heard the gypsy shot. I never heard the sound of the Mohican killing Matchstick. Knives are quiet things in themselves. I heard the Mohican telling the Gypsy to take the body, and the Gypsy running away, and the Mohican coming to me. He pushed through the screen of blankets, still holding the bloody knife. He said it was time to leave, that they had stopped handing out rations that morning. I asked him what Gypsy and Matchstick had wanted. He said they wanted something I couldn't give them. For a moment, I thought I knew why animals don't speak. Not because they can't, but because the terror stops them at the moment they need to beg for their life. The fear and hopelessness hits them when a two-legged creature comes at them with a sharp, shiny blade in its coiled white fingers, and they understand how much they've been fed, and how slow and weak they are, and how greedy and stupid they've been, and how their hooves and paws can't do what fingers can do, and they're outclassed, already dead, already meat. For a moment, I was an animal. I was a pig, ready to squirm under the butcher's hands, and squeal, only not to speak. Then I started grabbing words. I said, "Was that something mean?" I said, "Am I a pig?" The deeply unsettling scene culminates in Samarin's horrified realization of what his fate is likely to be. This reaction is likely to be shared by the reader, since it is at this point in the novel that we are, for the first time, able to recognize that the actions of the Mohican constitute metaphorical mappings. So we have this time the generic conceptual space of the story, the blended space here, input space 1, input space 2. So living being, we have here this Samarin, living being here is the pig who is helpless. We have here Samarin was protected by the Mohican, given extra rations by the Mohican. Samarin offered a chance to escape with the Mohican. For the pig, dependent on the care of the farmer, fattened for food by the farmer, and fate of the pig is to be slaughtered. Now we have to go back here. Samarin and the pig, helpless. They cared for the Mohican, cared for by the farmer, given food by the Mohican, given food by the farmer. These are both of their protectors. Samarin offered chance of escape with the Mohican, and the fate of pig is to be slaughtered. So actually both have different fate in them. Okay, so the pig was destined to be probably slaughtered, and for Samarin was destined to be given chances to escape. Conceptual blending theory helps to explain in explicit terms how Samarin's realization of his fate comes about, while also spelling out the dilemma that Samarin faces. Input spaces 1 and 2 are akin to the target and source domains of the conceptual metaphor. The mappings between these two domains are indicated by the unbroken lines between them. In the generic space are shared concepts from the two input space. The blended space is where we find the emergent meaning being generated. In this space, the entities of Sumerian and the pig are blended together. However, input space 1 contains one structure that has no equivalent in input space 2. This is the offer of escape from the Mohican to Sumerian, since this has no direct equivalent in input 2. Indeed, the source domain predicates the slaughter of the pig. This causes a mismatch in the blend, which gives rise to deep uncertainty to Sumerian. The Mohican will kill Sumerian, eat him. The blended space is where Sumerian sort of a dilemma, whether to stay in the camp and die or take his chance with the Mohican, which is generated. Okay, so we are down to the summary and conclusions of the whole report. A selection of key cognitive theories that may be used to explain the active role that readers take in interpreting texts. The concepts that link the three theories we have discussed is all about background knowledge. Schema theory suggests that readers make extensive use of pre-existing world knowledge to make the processes of communication and interpretation efficient. So a while ago, probably it was in conceptual metaphor theory that the schema theory was very significant and was very helpful in understanding how the metaphors were actually used in that theory. The notion of figure and ground in language works on the basis of applying schematic knowledge about spatial relations in our analysis of texts. Cognitive metaphor theory, it takes the notion of image schemas also and other types of schematic knowledge and demonstrates how such knowledge structures can function as source domains and conceptual metaphors. And in the case of each theory, substantial interpretative benefits can be gained from its application in stylistic analysis. What will be apparent from the discussion, of course, is that some of these theories are more fully developed than others. While there is empirical support for some of these approaches, there is still considerable work to be done in this area. Evans and Green, for instance, note the problems of apparent and falsifiability of blending theory, postulating that it does, as it does the existence of the conceptual structures that it attempts to demonstrate evidence for. So the example of the surgeon as a butcher and that of the story of Sumerian, Mohican, and Gypsy, both actually do not have, that are not related. Similarly, though some evidence is produced for the importance of schema theory in reading, Cimino claims that schema theory is rather unprincipled in what can count as schema, so that it is hard to prove empirically. Nonetheless, these cognitive theories are promising new approaches for stylistics and will gain in currency as they develop through empirical and analytical testing, but it just probably needs further studies in order to develop this new approach. Okay, so the following were already examples. Okay, and that will be it for my report. Thank you so much.